So I wish you a very pleasant evening, and let's start tonight with the reading of Hannah Arendt's poems in German and in English, and the reading will be done by my dear colleague Jutta Wagner.
Thank you, Lena, for that really beautiful and generous introduction. And thank you to everyone for coming this evening. My name is Samantha Rose Hill, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here in Heidelberg, my old home, and to be here with Paul. About a year ago, Paul and I started talking about listening as Donald Trump was reelected, as the world continues to fall toward right-wing authoritarian political movements. We started having a conversation about what it is we're actually doing when we listen to one another. Oftentimes we hear the rhetoric that we should just stop and hear each other, that we should just listen, and then we can get on politically. But these times don't call for that. They're calling for something else. And so working with Lena, we've put together this festival to think about different forms of listening. So tonight, the poetic ear, we will hear poems in a moment in German and English. And then in the next couple of days, we are going to be thinking about what it means to listen to music with Kathy Milligan. Paul's going to be in conversation with the brilliant psychoanalyst, Joshua Cohn, who can teach us something about what it is we might be listening for when we're with one another and what those moments of silences might say. And Paul's also going to be in conversation with Josh and George Proshnik to talk about what that silence is. Because right now we live in a world that is being flooded with sound, words, rhetoric, propaganda. And we need more quiet, perhaps. But we'll find out. So please don't just come tonight. Please come back over the next few days and let us think together about what it is we're doing when we're actually listening and all the forms of listening that we can engage in. I wanted to begin tonight with hearing Hannah Arendt's poems in German. Hannah Arendt wrote 71 poems that we know of, and she only wrote poems in German, in her Muttersprache. And I'm sure Paul and I will get to that at some point in our conversation. But she said that what remained for her after the war was not just the language of German, but the language of German poetry. So let us begin.
Kein Wort bricht ins Dunkel, kein Gott hebt die Hand. Wohin ich auch blicke, sich türmendes Land. Keine Form, die sich löset, kein Schatten, der schwebt. Und immer noch höre ich's. Zu spät, zu spät.
No word breaks the dark. No God lifts a hand. Wherever I look, this tremendous land. No shadow hovers, no form has weight, and still I hear, too late, too late.
Einmal dämmert Abend wieder, Nacht fällt nieder von den Sternen. Liegen wir gestreckte Glieder in den Nähen, in den Fernen. Aus den Dunkelheiten tönen sanfte kleine Melodien. Lauschen wir uns zu entwöhnen, lockern endlich wir die Reihen. Ferne Stimmen, naher Kummer, jene Stimmen jener Toten, die wir vorgeschickt als Boten, uns zu leiten in den Schlummer.
W.B. for Walter Benjamin. Eventide descends once more, night falls down from the stars. We stretch our limbs, reaching out to those near and those far. Gentle whispering melodies sound from the darkness. We listen so we can let go, finally breaking rank. Distant voices, nearby sorrow, the voices of those dead, the messengers we sent ahead to guide us into slumber.
Und keine Kunde von jenen Tagen, die ineinander sich brennend verzehrten und uns versehrten. Des Glückes Wunder wird Stigma, nicht Narbe. Davon wär keine Kunde, wenn nicht dein Sagen ihm Bleiben gewährte. Gedichtetes Wort ist Stätte, nicht Hort.
And no record of those days, tangled into one another, devoured by flames that burned us. The wounds of happiness become stigmas, not scars. There would be no record if your account had not been imparted. Poetic language is a place, not a refuge.
Dann werd ich laufen, wie ich einstens lief, durch Gras und Wald und Feld. Dann wirst du stehen, wie du einmal standst, der innigste Gruß von der Welt. Dann werden die Schritte gezählt sein, durch die Ferne und durch die Nähe. Dann wird dieses Leben erzählt sein, als der Traum von und je.
Then I will run as I ran before, through grass and trees and fields. Then you will stand as you once stood, the most heartfelt greeting in the world. Then the steps will be counted by what is near and what is far. Then this life will be recounted as a dream from long ago. Hannah Arendt said there should always be a third chair in the conversation.
For Elijah.
If anyone wants to get him some wine.
Samantha, what a pleasure, and what a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming. It's just great. I think I should just hold it. Yeah. I just wanted
That's a metaphor for Paul's career.
To show you the power I have. You know, I was going to begin in one way, and I'm going to begin in another way, because you mentioned you're removing it. Because you mentioned the current administration. That's how you began. I was surprised by it, but I'm very pleased that you did. And there's a quotation. By the way, I'm a quotomaniac by profession, so you're going to hear a lot of quotations. I need them desperately. They are kind of signposts in my life. And there's one quotation that Samantha brought to my attention some years ago, which I love, and which has perhaps something to do with Hannah Arendt, but perhaps not. But certainly with this moment for sure. And I don't know where it comes from in Emerson's writing, but it is, to my mind, I would love it. I would love for Jenny Holzer to do a huge, you know Jenny Holzer, the artist. She's a fantastic artist who does words that are projected on buildings. She when I used to work at the New York, I promise I'll get to Samantha. I promise.
We can talk about Emerson.
No. So she does these huge words, and she once projected words on the New York Public Library, recently declassified documents during the Iraq War. And I remember the president of the library not particularly wanting words to be projected on the walls of the library because of the dignity of the library. And I told him, you know, the library is all about classification. We need to have these words on the building. And I want Jenny Holzer to do a projection of this on every possible building, perhaps on your Rathaus here in Heidelberg, which Samantha showed me this afternoon. What a beautiful city. But anyway, Emerson said, "Let me never fall into the vulgar mistake of dreaming that I am persecuted whenever I am contradicted." Yes, exactly. Can you help me understand that well?
Well, I don't know. I think...
Do you know where it comes from?
It comes from... I think that passage comes... it's experience.
Possibly.
I think it's experience. Or no, maybe self-reliance. It's one of the two more known essays. I should know, I just taught Emerson. But I think that Emerson is really capturing a quality of thinking that can be really world-denying. And I think, in a way, it does relate to what Arendt describes in her notebooks as tyrannical thinking, or in Origins, what she describes as the function of ideology to divorce thinking from experience. So, when one says something and is contradicted, I'm thinking of another quote, actually, that Arendt liked to repeat that she heard from the great poet W.H. Auden, which was that contradiction is a sign of genius. Contradiction is a sign that one is engaging in the work of thinking, that they're present, responding to the experience now, and not holding on to some prefabricated way of thinking that must be right, which I think is what Emerson's capturing there. This feeling, the feeling of persecution when somebody reveals what we've said to be wrong or false, or contradicts our statement in a way that touches something inside of us that makes us turn on those defenses and walls us off from relating.
And in a way, what Emerson is talking about there is the inner dialogue, the fact that actually, I mean, I imagine that this quotation might make you think of some people in power now. And so I think that the notion of defining oneself with one point of view is so tremendously dangerous. I think often of Adam Phillips' wonderful line where he says, "To define is to distrust," and something to think about. Now, Samantha, in a sense, it's a homecoming for you. I mean, Heidelberg means something to you. We had the opportunity, Samantha and I, today to take the philosophic. My goodness me! Oh wow! I'll become a philosopher any day. But anyway, there's this wonderful line of Mark Twain about Heidelberg, which he says, "Out of the billowy upheaval of vivid green foliage, a rifle shot removed, rises the huge ruin of Heidelberg's castle with empty window arches, ivy-mailed battlements, mouldering towers, the leer of inanimate nature, deserted, discrowned, beaten by storms, but royal still and beautiful." So, bring me back a little bit to the Heidelberg you knew about 2 decades ago, or something of that sort.
Not that old, Paul.
No. You're not that old. Maybe just 1 decade ago.
But maybe we'll go back further. So, and maybe I'll say a little bit about putting together the collection of poems, which is why I came to Heidelberg.
Because that's when you started.
that's when I started. Arendt was a student in Heidelberg. Of course, she wrote her dissertation with Karl Jaspers at the university here on the concepts of love in St. Augustine. And it was during her time here, in a very youthful relationship with Benno von Weisse, that she started participating in the salon culture of Heidelberg, which was very formative to her early work on Rahel Varnhagen, who had been a disciple of Goethe and had started the salon scene 100 years earlier in Berlin. When I was working in the Library of Congress archives and found the first 21 poems, which Arendt had self-bound into 2 small volumes, I took them back to Massachusetts, where I was working on my dissertation. And my advisor said, I didn't know she wrote poems. Are they any good? And I said, there are poems, and I'm not sure if they're good yet. And so I wrote to Jerry Cohn, Hannah Arendt's literary executor, her last Lehrstuhl. He unfortunately recently left the world. And I said, can I have the permission to translate the poems into English, to publish them? And he wrote me back a beautiful letter, and he said, Samantha, yes, I love the poems. I would love for you to translate them into English. But if you do it, you have to understand that Hannah Arendt was not writing in the tradition of Emily Dickinson or Williams Wordsworth. She was writing in the tradition of Goethe and Hölderlin and Schiller. So I came to Heidelberg and I studied German Romantic poetry for 2.5 years before I took a stab at translating the poems. I don't recommend this as a methodology because this book took me 14 years to make, but that's what brought me here. And I worked with a brilliant professor who unfortunately passed during the pandemic, Peter Buse, who edited the first volume of translations. So this is very much a homecoming for me in many senses, because I think my happiest school days were spent here during my postdoc work. But I think this is really a homecoming for Arendt.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Partly because, though you found the poems in the Library of Congress bound by her, they were not necessarily to be published. And so, I had occasion to interview Ross Benjamin, the wonderful, wonderful translator of Kafka's diaries. German-speaking public here have read the diaries in their real incarnation, namely not Max Brod, but the diaries as they had been written. And Ross Benjamin translated the non-Max Brod diaries, which the book is about 3 times as long. And I began the conversation with him with another line of Adam Phillips, where he says that betrayal is an uncanny form of intimacy. Betrayal is an uncanny form of intimacy. And I'm wondering how you have felt bringing Hannah Arendt back home, as it were, but doing something that may or may not have been permissible for
her. When Kafka's diaries were first published in English, Hannah Arendt edited them, which not a lot of people know.
I don't know.
Yeah. So it's nice to have the new translation out in the world, but she actually made changes to what Brod had done, and that's a whole separate topic.
What did she change? Was it to to protect people? Or?
It was not to protect people. Okay. Now, when she read, she would edit. So, even when she was reading Kant, if you look at her volumes, like the Critique of Pure Reason, she crosses out words that Kant writes and corrects him. No, he really meant this. Or with Nietzsche, Schill. And then when she quotes them in her published work, she cites her version. So all of her footnotes are wrong 98% of the time. She's always having that conversation with the author, and you see that in her marginalia on the page as well. It's
a dialogue
in reading. Yeah, it's a dialogue in reading, and she described her writing process. I'm avoiding Paul's question if you haven't noticed.
No, I know.
I heard it, but she describes writing as taking dictation from herself. So she would lay on her couch and smoke and think, and then when the words came, she would get up and go to the typewriter and take dictation. So it was very conversational for her. And whenever I teach her work, I remind the students that her words are meant to be heard. She's writing in that kind of tradition of the bard, which often gets her into a lot of trouble then with texts like Eichmann in Jerusalem or The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she switches voices. The first 21 poems are in the Library of Congress archive, and those are the poems Hannah Arendt carried with her when she fled in 1933, when she fled Germany. Most of the rest of the poems are actually in Germany. When she came back toward the end of her life, actually shortly before she died, to organize Karl Jasper's estate as one of his executors, she brought her notebooks and left them at the German Literature Archive in Marbach. And so when I was working on the poems, I had the great pleasure of going to the archive, and I didn't tell them I was coming. And I knew the director, but I walked in and he's like, "Samantha, what are you doing here?" And I was like, "I need the notebooks." And he said, "They're in a display case in the museum." and it's like, okay, so how long are you here for? I'm here for a week. And he said, "Give me an hour and go, find a table downstairs in the reading room." And sometime later, he walked down the stairs carrying literally a banker's box that he had just tossed all of her notebooks into. And so I went through the notebooks and copied out all the poems and the different versions and edits. So she left half in America and half in Germany. And, I think about what Arendt says about finding Rahel Varnhagen's papers in the Prussian State Library, and how in her letters, she had found her best friend. It just happened that she had already been dead 100 years. And I think Arendt left her poems in the archive. She knew they would be found. And it has always deeply felt like a transgression to pull them out of the archive. Actually,
it did feel.
It does, and even touching them, even holding, these faded volumes. You can see where she took a needle and thread and sewed the pages together to create them in that kind of Emily Dickinson style fashion. These were intimate objects to her, and most of the poems are snapshots or records of events, losses, birthdays, relationships. And I think that they were her private life. And so I think that I will be thinking about the question of what it means to take the most intimate artifact of a person's private life, which has been housed in an archive, and to bring it into publish. But I think the real transgression that I have spent many nights lying awake thinking about is translating them. They weren't translatable for her. She wrote them in German, And I think for her, they only existed in German. I think that the language for her was what gave her a sense of place in the world after she was forced to flee. And so I've thought of it more as an offering to English readers who don't speak German, so that they might glimpse the more intimate side of her, which I think is important. But hopefully it encourages people to learn German.
I mean, you've given a whole new meaning to translation, the old notion of traductore, traditore, but you're speaking about it in a different way. The untranslatability as a form of transgression, as doing that is in a way doing violence to the original intent. But the deeper meaning of what you're saying is, we mentioned earlier, Muttersprache, the whole notion of a home in a language. Now, this, I think I know why you're smiling. I mean, this for me is an issue for myself very much. I'm a bit of a linguistic monster myself. I grew up with Viennese parents who fled Vienna, spent the war years in Haiti, lived in Mexico City, spoke 4 languages simultaneously. I'm told that I have a little bit of an accent. It's a real bouillabaisse of a situation. My German is passive, so I won't try it on you at all, but I do read it. And there comes Hannah Arendt and her strong statements about home being, the homeland being the Muttersprache. It's the one thing you can't take away. And it reminded me of a poet that I very, very much love, who happens to come from where my grandparents came from, Bukovina, from Czernowitz, namely Paul Celan. And there are a few moments in his writings that I will quickly mention, where he says poetry is a sort of homecoming. And then let me find another line that I very much like. He said, "Only one thing remained reachable, close and secure among all losses, language. In spite of everything, it remained secure against loss." And I'm wondering how that resonates with you if you put it into the Hannah Arendt context.
I think the image that's coming to mind is the inner core.
It's
the inner core,
right.
That the inner part of the self that cannot be touched. And the Arendt scholar Lindsay Stonebridge recently reminded me of a line from a letter that Arendt wrote to Crowley Aspers, where she says it's good that, we have this level of alienation. We need a thick skin to keep ourselves, apart. And I think for Arendt, retaining, she said in many interviews, I refuse to lose my accent. She didn't want to lose it. For her, retaining the language of German was an act of resistance. It was an act of defiance. But I think it was also for her a way of saying, what happened can't take away from the gifts of Goethe or Schiller or Hölderlin, or the music or the culture, those poems that she memorized in her youth that became part of her Hinterkopf that she carried around and had an ongoing conversation with in her head. what happens politically in some way is divorced from those constitutive parts of the self. And I think within that could become an object of shame or guilt, and one can say, no, I won't speak German ever again. That would be one response. But Arendt said, no, that is my Muttersprache. And for her, it was really the facility. There's a great letter that she writes to her husband, her first summer in America, when she's a housekeeper in Winchester. Heinrich Blücher, her second husband. When she first arrives in America in the spring of 1941, that summer she goes to work as a housekeeper in Winchester, Massachusetts, to learn English, which she learns in like 2.5 weeks. And she writes a letter to Blücher and says, you can really do anything you want with this language. People don't really care. You can't do that in German. And, I think, she spoke German, French. She learned French very quickly, Hebrew, Yiddish, and English. And she was not a monolinguistic thinker, much like you. She was a linguistic monster, was the word you used.
I use that.
Yeah. Has other meanings in the context of Eichmann and all that, but we'll leave that alone. So, she wrote The Human Condition in English, but then she translated it into German and rewrote the book. She wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism in English, and then she translated it.
But I love what you told me today on our walk. By the way, we didn't prepare the conversation today.
We didn't.
Actually, a friend of mine has told me that because I over-prepare all these things terribly much. And she wants me to do a whole series called Unprepared, which I think would be interesting in terms of just listening. And it's something that I'll speak with Josh Cohen about, because in a way, a psychoanalyst should not be too prepared. I mean, they should be receptive and open. But one thing that, I was going to say Hannah told me, no, one thing that Samantha told me on our walk was that Hannah Arendt could not write the introduction to her incredible essay that introduced Walter Benjamin to the Americans, called Illuminations. It was published by Schocken in 1969 or 1970, something of that nature. Incredible introduction. One of the most poetic introductions I've ever read of a thinker such as Benjamin. She could not write it in any other language than German. Can you say a little bit about that, about the notion that maybe it would have been a betrayal for her to write it in any other language?
She tried to write it in English. In the archive in D.C., there are drafts. And so Arendt is responsible for the English publication of Walter Benjamin's works, which his final works, which are published in the 2 volumes, Illuminations and Reflections. And he had entrusted them to her when they parted ways in Marseille shortly before he attempted to flee. And, she tried to write it in English, and then she gave up. I think there's like a paragraph and a half, and she writes it in German, and she writes a letter to Harry Zone, who had translated the Benjamin essays, and asks him to translate it into English for her. And then she edits his translation, and then she delivers it in German. And there's a video of this you can watch on YouTube for the Goethe Institute in North America.
Reading the Benjamin. I don't know that.
Yep. I'll send it to you.
Please.
We can include show notes, right, Lena? You can send them the Benjamin. Okay. And I mean, there's one other notable piece of writing. It's actually the most quoted passage from Hannah Arendt's work, at least in the United States right now, from the end of The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is the underlying condition of all totalitarian movements is loneliness. But Hannah Arendt never wrote that. Hannah Arendt I mean, that is the English translation, but that part of the book was added in 1958 as Ideology and Terror, and she wrote it as a Festschrift for Karl Jaspers. And the word she uses is not Einsamkeit, but Verlassenheit. I think, you know, Arendt's writing is so seductive in part because it is so poetic, at least for me. But I think to try and read her in one language is almost a failure to begin with. Jerry Cohen told me a fantastic story. He never told me not to repeat it, so it's fine. But her notebooks, which were published in German as the Denktagebuch, where somebody attempted to translate them into English and submitted the translation. And Jerry was horrified. He said, absolutely not. We'll never publish it this way because they're in 5 languages. She kept notes in 5 languages.
I can identify. A decade in the making, or more. Many years of Samantha Rose Hill's life was taken up by putting these 71 poems together, in sewing them together in this book. You wrote, at the same time, you wrote the biography. And are they diptychs? Are they in, is there, because you said something about this notion of intimacy. Is the life and the poetry connected in some way? I mean, deeper than just the fact that you're writing a biography of Hannah Arendt and translating poems of Hannah Arendt. I wonder what the connection is between these two movements in a symphony.
I started working on the poems before I started writing the biography. And
by the way, it's not just a biography. It's really an intellectual biography of a very high level. Anyway.
Thank you. And I put down the poems to write the biography because my publisher, they asked me to write it when Donald Trump was elected the first time. And then I was finishing the first draft when the pandemic started. I remember my editor emailed me, and Vivian emailed me, and she said, "Samantha, I hope you're okay. Hannah Arendt is more important now than ever." I was like, I'm fine. I'm not dead yet. I'll finish the book before I catch COVID. I promise. But
she's important again.
I moved between them, and I wrote the first draft of the introduction while I was working on the biography. So for me, I think I held them together as almost a public and a private portrait. And I have always approached the poems, in part because of what the poems are about, or who they're addressed to, as a biographical text, as an autobiography of sorts. And so for me, they were I have held them very much like that. One thing that I tried to do in both books and in the work that I've done on Arendt in general is to break apart what to me, at least when I was a student, felt like a crystallized image of who Hannah Arendt was.
That is to say?
Which is to say it's impossible to get a cover of her printed in anything other than black and white, I swear. Many hours of fighting. But you often see photos of her in black and white, often bent over a table, smoking, very serious, talking about evil, talking about totalitarianism. And the moment that I started going through the archive, I encountered somebody entirely different. Somebody who had this incredible, magnificent sense of humor. Thousands and thousands of pages of intimate correspondence with friends. And somebody who, in her public work had critiqued romanticism, had critiqued any form of allowing feeling to appear in public and sentimentality. And then reading her poems and realizing that she was a bit of a sentimentalist, that she never really strayed too far from Rahel Varnhagen, that she was a romantic at heart. And so, I've thought about it. I don't believe in a definitive biography or definitive anything, but I wanted to rounding off some edges of her biography, adding something to what it was that we knew through the archive.
And so that is also kind of a homecoming in terms of Heidelberg and Romanticism and the whole sense in which, today on our walk, just, the spirit of all those poets is right there with us. And it's interesting what you're saying about her and sentimentality and what you're saying. She wrote, I can't quote it off the top of my head, probably you can. She wrote wonderful lines about humor and about laughter. Do you remember what she says about laughter? She has a wonderful line about laughter.
Laughter is a form of self-sovereignty. And
what does that mean?
And the other quote that explains that in part is that, she agreed with Brecht, who had been a friend, that it is much better to take very serious things with a sense of humor than to take them very seriously.
Okay. I like that. Now, in terms of intimacy and in terms of sentimentality, one of the things that I spent the flight from Los Angeles, where I came from, so I'm slightly jet lagged, but jet lag is wonderful. It's a magnificent alibi. But I spent much of the flight rereading all the poems, and what struck me so powerfully is hands. Hands, the tactile and the tender are so present. And we can read a couple of the poems. I have a few of them that I can read or you can read. But the tactile, nearly as if there was a form of tactile inebriation one can feel. A real feeling of touch, of vulnerability. And I'm wondering if that goes in the direction also of what you were, kind of an embodied self rather than a disembodied, abstract self that perhaps sometimes comes through when one thinks about Hannah Arendt.
I think very much embodied. I'm thinking in the context of what we've been talking about, though, I think it also relates to this idea of home and language. Hands appear over and over again in the poems, and
nearly obsessively. They are there. So many hands.
Yes, so many hands. The hands of the dead, the foreign hand, the hand of tenderness, the hand of striking, and
my own hand in the poem I'm going to read.
Nearness. Do you want to read it?
No, go ahead.
No, please.
No, I read the poem because you're wondering why hands, but it's fabulous. You want to read it in German first?
No, you read it. Read it in English.
I won't read it in German, I promise you. Wenn ich meine Hand... No, I'm not reading it in German. When I consider my hand a foreign thing related to me, I stand in no country. I am neither here nor there. I'm not certain of anything. Then it seems to me I should scorn the world. Let time slip quietly away, as long as no more signs should appear. I look at my hand. It's uncannily near to me, and yet a foreign thing. It is more myself than I am. Is it more myself than I am? Does it have higher meaning? I also love, by the way, how her poems end. It just doesn't feel like an ending.
No.
No, I mean, it's they are strange.
Yes.
We will talk about whether they're good, but they are strange.
I'm thinking also of the word poesis, which was really important for Arendt, which means, to make, to create. But I think it's also that so much of her work is about touch, about physical presence. Even when she's talking about something like the proper public realm for political action, it's about bodies appearing in space with each other and the interessa between us. You want to read another poem?
And it's just one after another.
It's this tenderness.
What's happening here? My summer song, my fingers slip across summer's ripe fullness as my body aches opening toward the dark, heavy earth, fields where no one can hear us, woods where no one can see us. All is held in strict silence. We suffer when we love. So that this offering, this fullness, will not mortify the priest's hand. And in the anointed quiet, our pleasure will not die, pleasure in italicized. But exhaustion wants to destroy us when we lose ourselves there, and the waters overflow when we love, when we live. I mean, that poem, you might want to give a context for it.
I think the audience knows the context. I'm joking. I will. It's the most central poem for me, and it actually, of all the poems to translating that poem in particular, those first few lines felt exceptionally intimate. To translate that almost felt like making.
You want to read German?
No. Ich habe einen schweren amerikanischen Akzent. Das ist nicht so gut. Also. But Lena will get mad at me if I read it in German. I'm joking. It's a very intimate poem. So many of the first poems and the first 21 poems, several were included in letters to Martin Heidegger. Heidegger wrote poems for Hannah Arendt, and Arendt wrote poems for Martin Heidegger, and this was a very common thing to do. It's still maybe, I don't know if people write poems and text messages, but when people wrote letters to each other, they would sometimes write...
In the good old days.
In the good old days, they would write a poem. And so I've notated those
beautifully, by the way.
In the book, so you know which ones are about Heidegger. And you can follow the arc of their relationship through the poems, from those first quite central poems to the summer of 1925 when she ends their relationship.
Stop there all of a sudden. But and again, another line that I very much love of Paul Celan. He says, "Only truthful hands write true poems. I cannot see any basic difference between a handshake and a poem." There is this notion of bringing your full body.
And I'm thinking of the later poem that she wrote for her friend, the poet Hermann Brock, right, where she creates this image of, when you grasp a hand and then you feel the warmth still on your hand. You feel the hand that was there. And this for her becomes a metaphor for his absence. And he died in 1951 of a heart attack quite suddenly and quite young and quite tragically. And his death really, mostly unnerved her. She writes this beautiful letter talking about how, if you want to find me, I'll be sitting at home alone in the corner thinking about what it means to die. And, it's that felt presence of absence. And what it is that, that's another way of thinking about making and what we leave in the world when we're no longer here. I think for her, she, from the beginning through the end of the poems, there's a strong undercurrent of melancholy, which never is part of her personality, self. And I think part of that melancholy is this desire that we get in the poems. She wants to make something
durable. Because she talks about those houses that, and see again, Heidelberg. But it's true. The castle and
yes.
and what remains.
Yes, when Arendt returned to Germany for the first time after the war, she said that the landscape reminded her of a Heidelberg castle, half in ruins and standing forever. She loved ruins. She loved this city. She, the idea that buildings, might be durable. And so there's a beautiful poem that she writes when she comes back, where she says, Ich weiß, dass die Straße zerstört sind. I know that the streets have been destroyed.
Do you want to find it?
We can find it.
Because the one I'm looking for is the one about friends, not.
Oh, you want that one?
Yeah, that one too.
That one's.
And I'm trying. I had it noted down, but where is it? This is what happened, ladies and gentlemen. But you will find it.
So this poem, while you're looking for that one, is I know that the streets are destroyed. Where are the wagon tracks, miraculously unscathed, shining forth from ancient ruins? I know that the houses have fallen. I know that the houses have fallen. We entered the world in them, wonderfully sure that they were more durable than ourselves. We've forgotten this time. Does the moon and its more enduring light still bear the hoof marks like a ripple on the river's silent face? She's trying to recall an image, that feeling of no longer being able to recall once what stood somewhere, no longer being able to recall the landscape.
When I read that poem, I was thinking of the wonderful French sociologist who died in a concentration camp. I don't know if he's known here in Germany, named Maurice Alpvax, who wrote an extraordinary book about collective memory and what happens when a neighborhood is completely destroyed. For those inhabitants who still live in that neighborhood, the memory disappears with the building. Did you find it? Read it.
You read it.
No, you read it.
Ugh.
You want me to read it? I'll read it.
He has a better voice. No?
I don't know. I like your voice.
I like your voice too.
It's a mutual admiration. I love this. I do love this poem. And then I want to ask you about your love of poems and perhaps your relationship to Hannah Arendt's poems in terms of liking them or not. This one doesn't have few of them have names.
Mostly untitled.
Right.
Many have dates.
Has she ever said anything about any of that? Why some no? She didn't. Did she ever write anything about her own poetry?
No.
No.
She didn't tell anyone she wrote.
No, I know. Very few people knew about it.
To quote Elizabeth Young-Brule. Yes.
Yeah, including her very close poet friends. Robert Lowell. Auden didn't know that she wrote. She corrected Auden's poems.
She corrected Auden's, Randall Jarrell's.
It must be quite something.
Himmelbruch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this poem, this was the farewell. Many friends came with us, and whoever did not come was no longer a friend. This was the evening. Haltingly, it slowed our pace and drew our souls out of the window. This was the train, measuring the country in flight and slowing as it passed through many cities. This is the arrival. Bread is no longer called bread, and wine in a foreign language changes the conversation. I love this. I love this poem. And I don't love many of them, but I love this poem. Oh, how can you say it? It's Hannah Arendt, but I can say it. How about you?
I think that's a fantastic poem. You can hear the Herdity, the Broten Wein, and also, the Rhine, and and also as you were reading it, Brot is no longer, what that line even means changes when you translate it to English. But I think of the line from the essay on Walter Benjamin, where
the task. Her essay.
For her essay on Benjamin, where she says he was a poetic thinker without being a poet.
Which is fantastic, right? And you have the... Sorry, go ahead. No, but in your introduction...
I like digression. We're good.
Well, I often...
Digression implies we're going somewhere, though, and I'm not sure we are, so...
No, I wanted at one point in my life to teach a class on digression. But I only had the first sentence of the class, which was, this is a class on digression, but before I begin... Anyway, so there is a wonderful... Let me try and find it. Here. Where you say... And one need not write poems to be a poetic thinker. This is... Samantha in her introduction. I know all of you speak German, but get the English translation, because the introduction, which is very, very curt, very short, but extremely well written. And one need not write poems to be a poetic thinker. In Men in Dark Times, she reflects Hermann Brock was a poet in spite of himself. Remembering Jarrell, she wrote, what I mean to say is that Randall Jarrell would have been a poet if he had never written a single poem. Similarly, for Walter Benjamin, what is so hard to understand about Benjamin is that without being a poet, he thought poetically. This is marvelous, and it reminds me of, what Rudolf Kastner said about Rainer Maria Rilke. He said that even when Rilke washed his hands, he washed them in a poetic way. But anyway, you were going to say.
Hands.
Hands again.
Hands.
Honey, it's all the rage.
Hand on hand.
So maybe what we should talk a little bit about is this notion of poetic thinking. Poetic thinking and Dicht, the kind of concentration.
So I think there are many beautiful poems in the collection, and I think they're autobiographical. She's really marking different moments in her life. It's kind of like looking through a photo album almost. And the last one that you read is poetically, extremely beautiful. Some of the early poems in the first 21 are imitations of German Romantic poetry and written in end rhyme scheme. The one that drove me absolutely mad, which is the second poem that she wrote when she was like 18. Sehen wir uns wieder, wenn Blut weiter flieht. Ich habe kein Kissen, du sollst nicht mehr missen. And I'm just like, oh my God, this is not good. What do I do? But, it's also, as you said, it's Hannah Arendt, and you're getting this little snapshot of her at 18, studying poetry, studying theology, thinking about God, thinking about what it means to become a person in the world and make something. And there's so much angst in those early poems, so much existential uncertainty. And so I think they give us a picture window into her life. For Arendt, the language of poems was a way of thinking. She understood that words do things. W.H. Auden said, poetry doesn't do anything. But the language does do something. When we pronounce a word, we're not just saying a word. Our mouth makes a shape that we feel, that's embodied.
There's a wonderful French philosopher who I love, named Clément Rosset, who said that he wrote beautiful essays on joy. And he said, try to say joy in French without smiling. Joie, right? There is that
Joie
comes from, or the wonderful line of Christophe Sarah, who said that thought is made in the mouth. Something happens.
Yes. And she understood that. I think that's one of the reasons why her work is so durable. For Arendt, poetic thinking was a way of thinking, and she says in The Human Condition that the language of poems is the language that remains closest to the thinking process itself. So it is the most dense language that we have that can capture human experience. And the work on thinking and the unfinished life of the mind, she has this whole section on language and metaphor, from metaphorine, literally meaning to bridge over from the invisible realm of the mind to the world of appearances. So we have these thought things in that Benjaminian sense of the Denkbild, and how do we make those inner thoughts appear? And she talks about Proust in Origins when she starts thinking about this, even in the 1940s. We go out, we experience the world, and then we go home and we hold up our memories like the Madeleine to the mirror, to the mind's eye, and then we try and tell a story about it. And how do we capture that, nostalgia, longing through language? How do we, and she, when W.H. Auden reviewed The Human Condition in 1958 for Encounter magazine, he said first, I feel as though this book was written just for me, which is a fantastic feeling.
Auden says that.
Yes.
He said the same thing, by the way, about Cavafy.
Oh,
which is
interesting.
Very interesting.
Well, so the second thing he says, and you can tell me if it relates to the Cavafy, is that what Arendt really does in this book is give us a vocabulary. And there's a fantastic quote of hers that I think of all the time where she says, we're all born into this world and given a language, but we have to rethink this language. And for her, language was also a way of making the world. Wie bitte? Manifesting, making appear. There's one truly untranslatable poem in this volume that relates to this, and Jerry and I had a wonderful long lunch about it in New York once. I don't know if I can. It's quite short. It's only 4 lines, and what Arendt's really doing is meditating on the word for writing poem. Do you know where it is?
I don't know which one you're referring to, but while you're referring to it, I'll read a poem which in a way goes in the direction of poetic thinking.
Okay.
Which is, it's been. I'm convinced. I imagine possibly for the native speakers here of German, of which I imagine just about everybody is. Dichten.
That's the one I was looking for.
You read it.
No, you read it.
I read it.
You read it in German, and I'll read it in English.
Okay. Here we go. I think Lena will say to me, "Don't come back tomorrow." But it's all right. I mean, I'm looking for an honest job, so it's a good thing. Yeah. My parents were alive now. Hola. Verdichtet das Gedicht. Schützt den Kern vor bösen Sinnen. Schalle, wenn der Kern durchbricht, weiß der Welt ein dichtes Innen. Brilliant. Thank you.
And as I said, it's untranslatable. I think because Arendt is playing with the word Dicht, and I'll redo the translation. But for her, we the closest we have is poetize. But the very word for writing poetry, to write poetry in German, contains this Dicht.
And it does come from her interaction with Heidegger, I imagine.
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. But through the conversations, I think she kind of turns around and plays with that work in Heidegger on language and dwelling and thinking to make it worldly. Because for Arendt, it's always about the world in common together, being with one another, not about some notion of Eigentlichkeit, of authenticity that we can access in the field of being when we are completely alone, and then we can experience some form of true transcendent self, the being a being that's not a being, when we're away from the influence of the crowd. But for Arendt, she rejects that idea of authenticity. And I think this poem is really interesting, though, because she's holding on to that dense interior. But for her, it's the will, which is the organ of freedom, of being, where we can engage in that two-in-one conversation, or more than that conversation. She always quotes Richard III when she talks about this, am I a murderer? No, not I. Truly? Am I? And I don't know. I'm sorry, Shakespeare fans.
Before you go to the poem, what is that line that she quotes or misquotes?
Which one?
Of Cicero?
Never, yes, it's a misquote. Never am I less alone than when I am alone by myself.
Sort of the dialogical.
Never am I less alone than when I am alone by myself.
That's the very end of
Human Condition. Which is that worldliness. The fundamental condition of humanity, of being human for Arendt, is that we live in the world with others. Even when we're by ourselves, we're still conditioned by the world of appearances.
And in that way, she's close to other Jewish thinkers. In particular, I think of Buber. I mean, there is this connection.
The I and the thou. Yeah.
Buber has this wonderful line where he says, I love to retreat and read and be alone, but only on the condition that when I open the door, someone is on the other side there to recognize me. Mm. There is that. I'm misquoting, by the way. But anyway. We digressed enough for you to read it now in English.
I'm thinking of a story from Henry Miller's book on writing, where he talks about how at the end of his work session each day at his ridiculous, table, his wife would come into the room and take the pages from his typewriter and critique them. And sometimes he would have to hide them if he knew he had had a bad writing day. That's a different form of recognition. Density condenses the poem, shelters its core from evil intentions, shell, when the seed breaks through, show the world your dense interior. And then I have a long note of apologia for translating the poem.
Read it. Partly to give you, footnotes are important. And these notes or footnotes they're really helpful.
You really want me to read it?
Read it.
Arendt is trying to capture poetry in verb form, playing off the word dicht, as in Gedicht, dictet, und Gedicht, which means denseness. Dicht, denseness. Poetry, she argued, is dense because it is the form closest to thinking itself. In German, there is a word, Dichten, for what it is a poet does. The closest we have in English is poetize, but this gives the sense of making something poetic. It gives the sense of making something poetic. Whereas in German, it is poetic already in itself and is not made so.
Good, huh? I think so. Slowly we will wind down as much as I hate to. I used to ask my guests at the New York Public Library. I hate introductions, so I long introductions where you tell people all the honors they've gotten, and just such a bore. So I used to ask my guests to give me a biography of themselves in 7 words. The best one by far was Joan Didion. Joan, before we spoke, said, 7 words do not yet define me. And Carlson gave 7 words, which I found a few days ago when I was preparing for Samantha Rose Hill. And her 7 words were, Dichten equals kondensieren, might...
So.
Yes, I swear to you. Dichten equals kondensieren, might sum it up. Pas mal, huh? And then Richard Serra said, I have always preferred poetry and prose to fiction. Poetry condenses. So, Samantha, in closing, are you a big reader of poems and of poetry?
Yes.
Yeah. So, in the canon of poetry, I mean, you spent the better part of your younger years translating Hannah Arendt. It would be unfair for me to ask you if it was worth it. But no. And so I shan't. It's a rhetorical device to say.
I'm not so economical in my thinking.
No. But what is your assessment of Hannah Arendt as a poet, away from the idea that we get glimpses into her private self? Do you see what I mean?
I do. I think if I had to place Hannah Arendt's contribution, I think that's what you're asking me. If it is a contribution, and if it is, what kind of contribution it might be, I think I would place it not for the first 21 poems, but for the remainder, which are post-war poems that capture the inner life of a refugee who is wrestling primarily with loss. The condition of loss is a condition of life. What survives? What remains? That what there. And, those later poems, I think, are better in quality. They're not bound so tightly by a scheme. They're pre-verse. And they are conversational. I think she's a conversational poet, which is part of that dialogic thinking. They often feel like something one might, if we were sitting on a park bench and I they feel like something I might just share with you about something I'm observing or experiencing. That's how I think about them. That's where I would place them. The title, What Remains, I chose it for two reasons. One for Hannah and one for myself. So the phrase, which I'm sure many of you know, comes from that magnificent interview that she gave on German national television in 1964 with Günter Gauss.
If you haven't seen it, see it, please.
Yes. And he, so they're moving somewhat toward the end of the interview, and he says to her, "What remains for you after the war, after leaving?" And she says, "What remains? The language remains." When she says "die Muttersprache" in the interview, and then I think she takes a drag of her cigarette, and she pauses and she goes on and she says, "Let me explain. It's the language of German poems. Those poems that I memorized in my youth that I carry around in my hinterkopf that I will never be." So, excuse me. So,
What did that?
and I will never be able to do that again. Excuse me. So, these are Arendt's German poems. They're what remained for her. And I chose the title because this is what remains of writing about Hannah Arendt for me. So these two books are not just portraits of Hannah Arendt, they're also bookends.
Thank you very much.